Hey everyone, welcome to video number 4 for chapter 24, and in this one we're going to be talking about imperialism in China. So section 5 is a little bit of a longer section, so I'm actually going to break this up into 2 different videos. So this will be for videos 4 and 5. We're both going to be talking about China. So in the centuries leading up to the period of new imperialism, China had a very different relationship with the Western nations than the other regions we've discussed so far. In order to fully understand it, let's first talk about an important concept both for history and the modern world, and that's called balance of trade. A nation's balance of trade refers to the difference between how much a country imports versus how much it exports, right? So basically how much it sells versus how much it buys. You want to sell more than you buy. Prior to the 1800s, China had what we call a trade surplus with the West, meaning they sold more than they bought. So that's a good thing. The Chinese government strictly controlled trade with foreigners, which is one of the reasons why they were able to maintain this trade surplus. Europeans and other foreigners were restricted to one port city in southern China, okay, down around here, what was known as Guangzhou. And you can see by the flags of this city, okay, these were where you see the American one here and some of the European ones. That was the only port that they were allowed to go into. Even though the capital was up here, this was all off limits. Okay, they could not travel up there. They had to do business down here, and it was very, very regulated for everything. So not only did they regulate it, but the Chinese also believed themselves to be the superior civilization, and therefore they didn't believe that European traders had much to offer. This belief gets to the heart of the major difference between China and regions like Africa. China was the oldest civilization still in existence. They were an Asian superpower since the time of the Roman Empire. They had trade monopolies on things like silk, porcelain, and tea. This gave them a unique advantage when it came to trade. By the 1800s, though, there were 2 major developments that changed the relationship between China and the West, and that's Chinese decline and Western industrialization. Chinese wealth and power had gone down throughout the 1700s, while industrialization turned nations like Britain, the United States, Germany into wealthy, modernized powers. Now, this growing disparity, meaning unequal relationship, became very apparent in the conflict known as the Opium War. Now, we just mentioned in the previous slide that China had a trade surplus with European merchants. The opposite of this, which was experienced by the Europeans, is a trade deficit. Right? That means that you are buying more than you're selling. This isn't a good business model, obviously. But due to trade restrictions and the Chinese belief that European goods were inferior, there wasn't much business for them. Now, to counter these losses, British merchants began focusing their trade on opium. Now, opium is a drug derived from poppy plants. Now, it doesn't matter where you are or what part of the world or when you are. Drugs are always going to make money. It's a good business model, basically. These poppies, they were grown in India, which was under British control, and they would make these into opium and then traded that for Chinese tea. Now, the obvious problem here is that opium is an addictive drug. Just move me down here. Actually, move me up. There we go. This was an opium den. This was a common thing that you would see in China, even in western parts of the United States during the 1800s. They would be opened up by Chinese immigrants. But yeah, it's an addictive drug, and that's a problem. And it was made from the same substance that heroin is made. So essentially, the British were drug dealers for an entire nation, as kind of lampooned here in this political cartoon. Now, to counter this, the Chinese government outlaws opium. They said you're not allowed to anymore. And they called on Britain to stop the trade. But I think we all know what happens when you tell a drug dealer to stop. They're going to say, no, we're still making money. So Britain's refusal to stop selling opium eventually led to conflicts between Chinese and British warships, and in 1839, war broke out. By 1839, Britain was industrialized and they had superior firepower, now using their cannons and their gunships. Here you see the British gunships off here, and you see how the Chinese were still using old-fashioned frigates and junks, and they were being blown out of the water literally. The British easily defeated the Chinese. Now, with the end of the war, the British did not outright conquer China. Okay, that never happened. China was still too large and powerful to be conquered the way Africa and India were. But Britain did make China sign a series of what we call unequal treaties. The treaties were forced upon the Chinese and the British and made China accept some pretty rough terms. So the major one that we're going to be talking about is the Treaty of Nanjing. Here you see the British delegates, and here are some of the the Chinese imperial ones. So that was the first of these unequal treaties. And some of the terms that the Chinese had to stomach were paying indemnity to Britain. This means that China had to pay for the damages suffered by the British during the fighting. China also had to hand over control of Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is actually an island down here in southeastern China, and it was a very important trade port. And controlling it meant that you controlled all the trade coming in and out. Hong Kong would actually remain a part of the British Empire up until the late 20th century. China also had to open up more ports to foreign trade, but what was probably the most embarrassing demand was that China had to grant what's called extraterritoriality to British citizens. That means that British citizens are not subject to Chinese laws and courts, only British laws and courts. So a British person walking around in China, if they were doing something that was considered illegal by Chinese laws but not British laws, they could not be prosecuted, they could not be arrested. This sends a very clear-cut message about which law is considered to be superior and which is inferior. So this was all part of only one treaty, right? The Treaty of Nanjing. And that was the first in a series of unequal treaties. So the unequal treaties that followed were very embarrassing for China. We're going to stop it on this one, and then we're going to pick up with some other very serious domestic problems that China was experiencing, and it's all going to culminate in some major reform movements that we'll kind of finish up for the section with in the next video.